All right, this is the start of the third part of Class 1, navigating the contents of the Anne Arundel County budget. The charter emphasizes the comprehensiveness of the budget by specifically requiring these three components. The reporter's notes to the county charter make clear that the budget message is more than a letter of transmittal or a speech. It describes it as a full explanation in layman's terms of the contents of the budget, the fiscal policy, and revenue required. A quote-unquote thumbnail sketch of the fiscal planning of the county for the ensuing fiscal year. Both the current expense and the capital budget documents consist of a fairly limited number of specific types of reports that are generally mandated by the charter or the county code, and which are then used repeatedly throughout the documents. That's a lot of pages. 331 pages in the budget message and current expense budget, 606 pages in the capital budget and program. Some of you may be aware of Thomas Jefferson's customized Bible, created by his careful cutting and pasting of just the sections he wanted to focus on. It ended up being an 84-page document. I mention this only because that's the purpose of these shorthand versions. There's a link to a separate PDF file with a compilation of these pages. I'll review each of these in turn. Bottom line is, if you understand these, you pretty much understand the whole thing and are enabled to drill down if you want more. This is a screen snip of how the budget message and current expense budget are published together as one PDF file on the county website when the link is first opened from that county website. The document is bookmarked to make your navigation easier. Depending on your browser or the software used, this bookmark structure may be presented differently, and it may be hidden initially. These bookmarks constitute the table of contents. This shows the table of contents page of the overview for the capital budget and capital program. Each of the project classes and the overall appendix is published on the website as a separate PDF document. An organization chart is important because things don't get done unless someone is responsible for getting them done. While there are many different ways of running an organization, most local governments are organized in a standard hierarchical manner. And that's certainly the case for Anne Arundel County. Budgets and expenditures need to be accounted for in order to hold those leaders accountable. So these organizational units are explicitly included into the county government's chart of accounts, which we can explore more in a separate sidebar presentation. A picture is also worth 1,000 words, and it can be useful in highlighting some interesting relational dynamics, the history of which can also be explored in a separate sidebar presentation that I'm working on. Regardless of which historical version you look at, they all highlight some fairly basic organizational features. The county government part generally occupies the top 3/4 of this page. The state government pieces are shown in the bottom quarter of the page. There are some quasi-government entities that are shown here over on the right. And within the county piece, it's broken down into two branches, the legislative branch and then the bulk of it is the executive branch. Within all of these groupings are placed the individual departments and agencies, including some non-departmental entities that are deemed important enough to show. That's the county executive's prerogative. Everything reflected on these org charts is funded in some form by the county, but there are significant differences in terms of responsibility and governance. For instance, a lot of people do not appreciate the fact that some of these seemingly county entities are in fact state entities. For example, the Board of Education, the community college, the libraries. They clearly act in the county's interest and are largely funded by the county, but they are nonetheless entities of the state. Now, the next 10 pages or so do not really provide much in terms of the fiscal 2024 budget. Like many of the pages in the budget overview, they provide useful explanatory information, but the information doesn't change much from year to year. Two key terms are used on this page that warrant further explanation. That is the level of appropriation control and the general classification of expenditures. To explain that, I've got a little sidebar presentation that we're going to play now. All right, welcome to the Government Accounting 101 sidebar portion of the Understanding the County Budget class. Okay, so I'm just going to let that play out in class, but when that's done, then I'll come back to this part of the presentation. So that explanation is dry, but those concepts are the linchpin of governmental accounting and reporting framework necessary to uphold the principles of accountability and transparency. Understanding that will make understanding the budget itself and using data exploration tools much more intuitive. The summary of changes in budgetary fund balance, these 2 pages, are extremely important. At the heart of government finances is the concept of fund accounting. As I mentioned earlier, governments need to create funds to account for related expenses and revenues. For example, the Water and Sewer Operating Fund contains the budget to run the county's water supply and wastewater treatment system, and the revenues collected, primarily user charges, to pay for the system. All of the county's funds are either governmental funds, proprietary funds, or fiduciary funds. All funds other than the general fund are subject to appropriation in the current expense budget are collectively referred to in the budget document as other funds. Proprietary funds are used to report on activities financed primarily by revenues generated by the activities themselves. And there's 2 types of proprietary funds. There's enterprise funds and internal service funds. So these are the funds that are represented on this page here. You have some fiduciary type funds. They contain resources held by a government but belonging to individuals or entities other than that government. Examples include the Pension Trust Fund, the Retiree Health Benefits Trust Fund, and other agency funds. These are typically unbudgeted funds, so you won't see them here. because you don't need the appropriation authority because laws mandate that these funds be distributed in a specific manner governed by contract law, so there's no need to create appropriations. And then the governmental funds account for all other activity, and there's 4 primary types of those. The general fund, which is the big one, which accounts for basically everything that isn't otherwise accounted in these other funds. Special revenue funds, there's a lot of those, and those are primarily like grant funds or other revenue streams that are specifically dedicated by state or federal law to be used for a specific purpose and no other purpose. So they aren't general discretionary funds, so they can't be put in the general fund and just be used for whatever you want. They're restricted, so they're in those special revenue funds. And there's some capital projects and debt service funds. The budgetary fund balance represents the amount of net assets that are available for appropriation, consistent with the budgetary basis of accounting. And this is perhaps the single most important financial metric in government budgeting. Budgetary fund balance data as of the end of the previous fiscal year. So this budget is for fiscal 24. We're in the midst of fiscal 23's budget. It hasn't been finished yet. So the fiscal 22 year is the last final complete year. So we know what the ending fund balance for the fiscal 22 year was. And that's what's represented in this column of numbers. And that's obtained from audited annual comprehensive financial reports. This starting figure is subject to careful pre-review by the Office of Finance and the legislative branch's county auditor well before the proposed budget is finalized. We then estimate, because again, the year hasn't finished yet, the current 23 budget year is still in process. So we don't have the final revenues and the final expenditure amounts. So these are estimates of revenues and expenditures. You just simply take the fund balance at the end of fiscal 22, add to it the revenues, subtract from it your estimated expenditures, and you have a new fund balance at the end of fiscal 23 that you're projecting. And then you have your estimates of revenue for 24 and your proposed expenditures in the 24 budget. And you need to make it be 0 because you must have a balanced budget according to the county charter. You're using fund balance plus revenues that you're estimating, and then this is your plan of expenditure. So these 2 pages are the most important in the entire budget book. It lists all the funds. It goes on to a second page, and pay attention to the notes. Any changes and anomalies will be discussed in the notes. Then we've got 2 comparative statements of revenues and of expenditures. All of the various financial statements, and you'll see a number like these in the budget books, all of the various financial statements that have the title starts with comparative statement of include columns of data in accordance with the requirements that are set forth in the county charter. That for the last completed fiscal year, you must show the data. So that's the FY22 actual. The estimated receipts and expenditures for the currently ending fiscal year. So that's 23. So that's what the revised column is for. Revenues and expenditures recommended by the executive need to be shown. So that's what this column is about. In addition, we've provided, just for additional clarity, we've provided the original budget for the current fiscal year, not just the estimate of what we think it's going to turn out to be, but what we originally in the budget estimated and assumed. And we also include a variance column, which basically says this amount in 24, how does that compare to that original amount? The budget to budget comparison. This is a key high-level statement for general fund revenues. Now, I'm not going to really speak to the substance of these pages. I'm just giving you the format stuff. But I do want to point out that all local governments in Maryland are extremely fortunate to have such diversified revenue portfolios. This is not typical of most local governments throughout the country. To have no single revenue source accounting for much more than a third of the total general fund revenue pie makes our overall portfolio much less volatile than many other local governments in other parts of the country where the property tax represents 70% of the revenues coming into that entity. Similarly, there's a comparative statement of expenditures. So the same columns of data are shown. Because the expenditures, what the money's going to be spent on a department by department basis, is of such interest to the entities themselves and the public, we did add a dollar and percentage increase from the original here. So we added the percentage. And then the last part is the position summaries. These position summary reports are not required by the county charter, but they're included for informational purposes and in accordance with standards provided by the GFOA. The first report here is a high-level summary, including all of the positions across all county funds. You got your general fund total, again, the largest piece of it, and then you've got your other funds. Now, the important thing here is it's all the funds, but it doesn't include positions in the Board of Education, community college, or the public library systems. The dollar amounts do, but the position counts are not shown here. Why? Because they are state entities, and they follow their own personnel systems and their own personnel rules and regs. We could get that data from them and report it here, with an asterisk to say that, this is just what they've reported to us. It doesn't come from our systems. And that would probably be a good idea to do that. But this gets back to that issue of, what's a county agency versus what's a state entity. Those three are state entities following their own state-controlled personnel systems. So we don't report on that here. The second report is just more detail. It takes that general fund total and breaks it out by department. Now, these are positions in the county classified service. What that means is positions that are in the merit system. That's not the same thing as saying that they're unionized, because there are a number of employees that are not represented by unions, but they are protected by being members of the merit system, which means that they're protected with strict rules governing dismissal and other punitive personnel practices for political reasons. So it protects employees from the spoils system, basically. Now, the third report lists those positions that are exempt from the county classified service. So these are what I would call at-will positions. They're the appointed department heads, people that work in the legislative branch, like the council members and their aides. So there's far fewer of these types of positions. This is the slimmed down 10-page version showing the org chart, given the reasons why I didn't include the other pages, the all-important summary of changes in budgetary fund balance, this comparative statement of revenues and expenditures in the general fund, and the position summaries. These are the key numbers and relationships in terms of reporting who reports to who and under who. Next section is the current expense budget.